Andy was my older brother. Everybody loved him. We did have a great relationship growing up. I was 10 and Andy had just turned 16 when my dad passed away. That was very hard. Andy was there and was ready to take on anything he needed to take on as the man of the house. And he made sure me and my mom were both very well taken care of. Andy always wanted to be a police officer for as long as I can remember.
I worked many years with Andy Kimbrell on night shift and through the different assignments. And he was the nicest, positive attitude, happy, eager, every definition that you could think of as a good friend, a good police officer, that would fit him to a T.
When Andy came to work for the Vestavia Hills Police Department in October of 2002, he was assigned to my shift. When you describe a police officer as to serve and protect, that's exactly what he did. Always wanting to do things for other people. A real happy, positive guy.
Andy and Dawn were high school sweethearts. Him and Dawn had a great relationship. You could just feel the love between them when you were around them. Dated for years before they got married. They were, beyond excited to welcome a child, and especially a little girl. They were thrilled to be parents.
He was the happiest he could ever be was when him and his wife had the baby.
I would say that it was a dream come true for him. And then subsequently, there were some medical conditions and medical issues that took a turn, and tragically, his wife passed. To say that his world stopped would be an absolute understatement.
Dawn passed away shortly after their daughter was born. He struggled. I'm sure, having a new baby was a lot for him, and then, shortly losing his wife was, a whirlwind for him at the time, and he was never the same.
Watching one of your own officers go through what he had to go through was very traumatic for all of us.
But, just like he did when my father passed away, he really just stepped up and did what he needed to do, and was a great father to Emma. We always hoped that Andy would find just happiness again, just genuine happiness. He met Stephanie at a school carnival. Her son was the same age as Andy's daughter, and so they were kind of at the same stage in life. I felt like, they would be a good match for each other. When they were together, you could tell they were enjoying each other's company, and, there was an attraction there. You could definitely see that as well. Andy would be kind of silly and just very affectionate. It was nice to see Andy happy. Stephanie, her and I, we would go out to lunch occasionally. I always wanted a sister-in-law, to be able to be close to, and I wanted to get to know her. I wanted to be a part of their lives. She was very quiet. She didn't really talk about, her family or about her past, what her background was, or any, personal details about herself. I remember not being completely comfortable to ask her those things because she wasn't sharing those things with me automatically. Her background was definitely a mystery, and it does make you wonder, if there was more to this story than we know. One day, My mom came to me and said, I think Andy got married. And I, of course, was very caught off guard. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, he showed me this piece of paper and it looked like a marriage certificate. And I said, surely not. I said, surely he would have told us. I was a little bit shocked and, obviously hurt by, the fact that he had gone off and gotten married and didn't, tell us before or even after. Those are things you tell your family. And if you're not telling your family those things, there's a reason you're not telling them. It felt wrong. And, it made me wonder whose idea was this. I think there was some manipulation going on. After they had gotten married, you could notice some problems. They would seem to be arguing quite a bit. Stephanie definitely had a temper. I just remember thinking, something's not quite right. Andy didn't really go into a lot of details. But, he definitely struggled. Kind of his whole world had been rocked at the point. She was very manipulative. I feel like she did things, to deliberately get a rise out of Andy. Stephanie absolutely knew how to press Andy's buttons. Her behavior definitely felt kind of mind game-ish, for lack of better words. And then, so I definitely think that was kind of her lifestyle. There were instances where their arguments got out of control and got physical. There was one instance she threw Andy's belongings off the balcony of their apartment. They lived in a very, busy apartment at this point. So she had to know that other people were going to see it. And she may have very well done it to embarrass him. That's humiliating. When Andy and Stephanie would have arguments, Andy would go over to my mom's house. That was his escape, to get away and kind of remove himself from the situation. Stephanie would follow him. Essentially track him down. And Stephanie did show up at the house, banging on the front door. She called him and asked him to come outside. He went outside and she went immediately up to him and kissed him. He was very caught off guard by it and kind of stepped back because this, of course, is in the midst of an argument, and, asked her what that was about. And she said, I just wanted to see if there was anything there. And she said, and there's not. And I just remember thinking, well, that was very odd. It just seemed like she was playing a game. This is not normal. This is not okay. She definitely had that Jekyll and Hyde kind of behavior. She was most definitely trying to manipulate him and assert her dominance. That was definitely the moment that I stopped being friendly with her and stopped reaching out to her. At that point, I didn't know what the future held for their relationship. I never in a million years thought it was going to turn out the way it did.
Oh my God. Andy.
I could definitely see Andy trying to have his life appear to be as normal as possible. This is a photograph that Andy had posted on Facebook. It looks like a picture that actually Stephanie took of the two of them, and underneath it there is a comment that Stephanie posted that says, "Oh, who's that hot chick in your car?" Stephanie, it appears, has definitely doctored the photo. She seems to have a filter on her face. The post is all about her. But I also think that was in Andy's nature, to be all about her. Andy responds with, "That's the most beautiful and amazing woman in the world. My partner, my other half, my best friend, my wife, Stephanie Kimbrell." He thinks obviously very highly of her and seems to be very much in love. Thinking about it now, it makes me feel a little bit sick to my stomach. Andy, even if he knew 100% that that relationship was not a good situation, I don't think he ever would have said to us, "You're right." He just tried to be the tough guy police officer.
Andy would not have been the aggressor, in my opinion. Andy was not that type of person. He wasn't the type that would run from anything, but he was also not the person that was trying to provoke anything either. Looking back on it now, there's some signs that we probably missed.
I definitely think it was getting worse. There was a situation where Andy's daughter was on the phone through Snapchat with a friend of hers. And they could see them arguing. The friend could see Stephanie and her behavior. And had even brought up the situation to her mom. The girl was that concerned about what was taking place. If that was happening that night, it was probably happening much more frequently than we heard about or knew about.
In 2018, when I got reassigned, I would see him in passing, and there would be days that he wouldn't be as jovial as normal. There was a change in his demeanor.
We had both moved on to different assignments. I think each of us knew deep inside that we wanted to talk, but we just never went to that level.
Andy was secluding himself from us, and so that was very hard to wrap our minds around. The changes in his personality alone would show you that he was struggling. We never, openly saw him tearful, but you could definitely tell that he was struggling. But it really got to the point where he wasn't spending time with my mom that much. And one day Andy had came over to the house. He had asked me if I could print something out for him. You could tell he was not in the best mood. We were in the living room together, and my son was kind of tugging on his jeans and trying to get his attention. All he had to do was kind of reach down and pick him up and, something. And it didn't happen. I knew something was going on with him because that was not like him to do that, to go from this doting uncle to, somebody that's pretty much ignoring him. And that was really a moment, I guess, that was really a turning point for me to see that. And so very blatantly said, "Hey, I don't know what is going on with Stephanie or anything else, but, my child deserves to have an uncle that he knows. I'm here to help, but I'm not going to be the person you call when you need something. I want to be a part of your life." I proceeded to say some pretty hurtful things. Some I meant, some I didn't. And our relationship at that point became pretty much non-existent. That was the last conversation I had with him. I would reach out to him periodically just to, to say, hey, I just didn't get a response back. But I remember hearing their arguments became more frequent. The people that lived in the apartment complex reached out to us and told us they saw them arguing in the parking lot. These total strangers are reaching out to us, to tell us these stories. It's one thing to have an argument inside your home, but when you are completely, oblivious to that you're having an argument in the middle of a parking lot with people around, and, I definitely think that shows some sort of escalation, that things are getting out of control. There was one instance where he went to my mom's house and showed her scratches on his neck, where Stephanie had put her hands on his neck. I don't know how they got there, if she was choking him or just had put her hands on him in some form or fashion, but there were visible scratches on his neck that appeared to be, pretty significant. I think most people, including myself, when they hear of a domestic violence situation, you automatically assume it's probably initiated by a male, but things are not always what they seem. My mother was upset. She was obviously very fearful for him. Her words were, "Please come home. You need to get away from her. She's going to kill you." It wasn't a good situation for Andy or Stephanie or the kids. Anybody involved in it, on all sides, it was not a good situation. And it is heartbreaking to watch. He never came out and said, yes, I know that our relationship is not right.
I think that Andy just didn't know how to, or didn't know where to go to for help.
He was just completely hiding it from everybody. I think that he was good at turning it on when he needed to turn it on, that I'm fine, I'm good, just let me go to work.
But knowing Andy and the type of person he was, he wanted to fix it. We were frustrated watching it all fold out and wanting to just take him and, and shake him and say, listen to us, please do something.
Oh my God. I need help really bad.
Calm down.
I'm freaking out. Please come and help.
What's going on?
My husband and I were having a disagreement. He took his gun in my hand and it just went off. I'm telling you, I had no idea that was loaded.
You shot your husband, ma'am?
Yeah.
You're being responsive right now, ma'am?
I see struggling, but no. Oh my God. Oh my God. Andy.
About 11:15, I received a phone call from our deputy chief of police, and he said, Andy Kimbrell's been shot. And I was like, where's he at? And he said, he's on his way to UAB. Andy was still alive, and I said, I'm headed to the hospital.
We were asleep in bed, and I got a call, one of the captains from Vestavia Police Department, and his words, I will probably never forget them, were, Andy's been shot, and it doesn't look good. I remember just panic, just absolutely panic, and just not knowing what to do. I didn't know. I mean, I assumed it happened at work, but I didn't know, how do I tell my mom this? What do I say? What's next? I didn't know what to do.
They brought him down to the hospital. So I walked into the emergency room. I met with the nurse and met with the doctor. They let me in the room where they were working on him. And, I just remember walking in and seeing Andy laying there, and his head was bandaged up, and I could see one of his eyes. But I just remember looking at him and going, "Wake up." And that's when I found out that he had been shot in the head. They had him on a ventilator, and they said, "We're trying to track his brain activity." And everybody was frantically trying to do anything they could for him. And so I remember asking the doctor, if he's shot in the head, is he going to make it?
When I first got the call, my sergeant called me and told me that there had been a shooting at an apartment in Garndale. When I arrived on the scene, I entered the master bedroom. The walk-in closet is to your left, and about middle ways down the wall, there's a door leading into the bathroom. There was a bloody handprint on the toilet. Inside the closet, I could definitely see blood splatter. On one side of the wall, there was a large pool of blood. In the corner, at first glance at the blood splatter, I could tell that it was not a long-range shot, that it was fairly close. The gun was a 9mm Glock, fairly standard issue for law enforcement. A shell casing was right outside the door of the closet on the floor of the bedroom. Whoever fired the shot was standing in the doorway of the closet or very close to the doorway of the closet. After leaving the scene, we returned to the police department. Stephanie had been placed in the interview room. We just kind of introduced ourselves, and she agreed to speak to us.
When we have a disagreement, we can't just talk. Andy can't talk. He gets really upset. He's a high-stress, high-anxiety person. So I can't talk to him because he immediately is mad, and then he storms off. And then he comes back, and then he storms, that's just how things go.
What was that argument? What was that particular time? What was the argument?
The whole thing. 90% of him being mad all last night was that trainer. I said, okay, I'm not doing anything wrong. You have nothing to worry about. Mm-hmm. Just reasonable, rational conversation. I've never been unfaithful to you. I don't so much as look at other men. You don't want to hear none of it. Lies, lies, lies. BS, BS, BS.
Stephanie told us that he'd accused her in the past of being unfaithful. So according to Stephanie, this argument wasn't out of the blue. She was basically painting a picture of her being just an extremely calm, non-combative, non-argumentative person.
I don't know, we were just scuffling and...
Did he hit you or grab you?
No, nobody hit.
Did he hold him against the wall? Or
he just grabbed me, and I was in front of the closet, and he spun around and went and got the gun and pulled it out of the holster and shoved it at my hand.
How did he hand it to you? You remember?
He just shoved it. His hands weren't even off it.
Did you say anything to him?
It happened so fast, and pow. I don't even know. I don't know.
I've been in law enforcement for over 24 years. I've never seen a gun just go off. On a Glock, the safety is actually on the trigger. So in order to disengage the safety, you have to pull the trigger. So, it was obvious that the trigger was pulled.
When he tried to give you the gun and put it in your chest, why didn't you just walk away then? I mean, you had a way to get out of there. All you had to do is, hey, and turn around. But you went and grabbed for the gun.
No, I didn't. I didn't reach for it and grab for it. That's not what happened.
I mean, your hands had to be outward, or they would have touched the gun. You see what I'm saying?
I don't know. It just happened so fast.
I know that if someone is trying to shove something at me that I don't want, I'm not going to reach for it. I'm going to back away, or I'm going to put my hands up. I'm not going to grab it. The longer she talked, the more question marks and red flags kept popping up.
Under her story, they were both standing up, and Andy had the gun in his hands, and he shoves it into her hands when the gun went off. But the fatal wound, the only wound on Andy, was a bullet strike to his forehead, just above the hairline.
We're trying to figure out why the entry wound would be on the top of his head. Was he kneeling down?
That towards me.
I don't think he can really be bent over far enough to where the round hits him in the top of the head.
It just wasn't possible for a gun to go off at waist level and the entry wound be basically on the top of the head. It just didn't make sense.
Can we find out about him?
Yeah, I mean, he's at the hospital and the doctors are taking care of him, so.
When we got to the hospital, one of the pastors that the police department uses was there. I don't even remember what he said, but made mention of the coroner. And that's the moment that we learned he had died. And that's the moment that I learned that Stephanie had shot him. I just remember being in shock. This has to be an accident. This has to be, what could have happened? Did she realize what she was doing? Did she, was it an accident? Was it, I never, and even to this day, it's hard to wrap my mind that she possibly could have a gun in her hand and fire it at him. It's hard to make sense of that.
I just got off the phone with the doctors, and I'm sorry to tell you this, but he's passed away.
I mainly kind of wanted to just gauge her reaction. And so, in the interview, you can see me just kind of laser focused on her, really. She sounded upset, but when she raised her head up, she wasn't crying.
And they're in the moment of, letting family members know and stuff like that, so kind of going from there.
I looked directly into her eyes, and they were dry as a bone. There was no tears in her eyes whatsoever. What really happened was really going on here. What Stephanie didn't know was down the hall, we had several witnesses that were present in the house that night.
I'm going to take the mail from the police department, and you are Emma.
When I was told that, it changed everything. Down the hall, we had Stephanie's son and Andy's daughter.
I'm Detective Fennell from the police department, and you are Emma.
Andy's daughter begins to talk, and she kind of just starts describing what she's been through and, again, the loss of her mom at a young age and now the loss of her father. It was very tough not to get emotional interviewing her.
How long after they got together did they start this argument?
When they were dating, they would argue a lot, so I didn't think they would last long because they kept on arguing.
Mm-hmm. So they've been kind of bickering and fighting from the beginning.
Yeah.
During the arguments, who seemed to be the more aggressive?
She seemed more aggressive.
She did.
Then my dad screams, but she's more because I know she's hit him maybe once. And I remember him saying she put him against the wall with it on his neck like that.
According to what we were told, Stephanie was the physical abuser in the relationship. She was the verbal abuser in the relationship. That painted quite a different picture than what Stephanie was telling us. At one point in the evening, she had received a text from Andy saying, lock your doors, she's crazy.
Around 8, I texted, he told me to keep my door locked or something because she was screaming.
Stephanie's son advised us that he was asleep the entire time and he didn't hear anything.
When you went to sleep, did you go to sleep? You just gotta lay there, or you did go to sleep? Okay. So you didn't hear? Okay. All right. So after you went to sleep, you wasn't woken up by arguing or yelling or any loud noises or anything like that? You pretty sound asleep?
Andy's daughter, she was a very important witness because not only was she directly across the hallway from the incident, she was awake the entire time.
I think it was 10:30, something close to 11, and I heard her say something give me your gun or something. I'm gonna.
When you were down there waiting, you and your sister talked, right? Y'all were talking. What was said? Remember?
I'm not sure what happened. And she said that she asked for his gun, and they said, "Find your hands," and they showed me her hand, and she knew it was loaded, and something about firing.
Yeah.
And he said, okay, and then gave it to her. I stayed because I heard that, and then it went on, and I just heard it talk.
When Andy's daughter made the comment to us, it changed everything. I know in my mind, this just changed from an accident to a possible murder. We went back down the hall and spoke with Stephanie again, and we confronted her with that detail.
He said something to the effect, if you think I'm so bad, then shoot me.
Oh, yeah, he talks to me like that all the time.
And then you replied, well, then give me your gun.
No.
So
I have never asked for that gun.
Okay, so if hypothetically, say if your kids said that they heard that, they would be lying.
Lying? No. They didn't hear what they think they heard.
See, what you don't understand is they're in 2 bedrooms with the door shut, and y'all are loud enough. They just didn't make this up.
And they did say that.
And they did say that.
I don't know what to call you.
Her credibility in my eyes was over. It was done.
In the mugshot, she's clearly injured. Defense attorneys and certainly members of the public, they get to see the mugshot, have some suspicions as to how she got her injuries and been blaming the victim, Andy.
Like this comment here in the picture, you can tell she's been hit. She doesn't deserve to be in jail if she was defending herself.
It's extremely hard to read these comments, just absolutely heartbreaking. The first post says, probably beat her many times before and got away with it. More than likely, she was tired of the abuse. Andy was never abusive to her. You want to scream it from the rooftops, but there's some people that are gonna, question the situation, and especially after seeing her booking photo.
This is a video that was taken from the jail surveillance footage that shows Stephanie Keller while she is in custody and handcuffed. This was taken a few hours before her mugshot. The video itself was interesting, to say the least. And she essentially takes a step towards the vending machine. She nails the vending machine with her face. It would seem to be a very intentional act.
It's very difficult to not be able to reach out to these people that are saying these horrible things, and tell them, you're wrong, this is not how this is. This is a very different situation. When we went to the trial, any doubt that I had that this was a horrible accident just went away very quickly. It's hard to think that somebody that I let in my life and had a relationship with is capable of something so horrible. It's a hard pill to swallow to think about that.
When Andy's daughter testified, her story was very impactful for the members of the court. It was impactful for the jury. The judge did come down with a sentence of 20 years in the penitentiary for Stephanie Keller, and that was the maximum under provocation manslaughter.
I think that the sentence that she received was appropriate. I mean, you know, nothing is ever enough. It will never be enough. But it also won't change it, no matter what it is.
As a police officer, we're usually the ones that say, hey, here's how you handle this situation. And when we can't do that for ourselves, we question ourselves as to whether we're a failure. And so we have to reach out for help, just like everybody's reaching out for us to help.
Losing Andy had a very much an emotional impact on the department. Every member of the police department was at the funeral.
People came from everywhere, you know, and they just heard about it and wanted to come and show their respect. It makes you so proud to be driving down the road and seeing flags that are, you know, for him. It was definitely a moment to be proud of him. I mean, I will always be proud of him. He was a really great person and a great father. You know, I wanted to remember all the good things that he did as a police officer. Honestly, if I could say anything to her, I would ask her why. I think she's a horrible person. I think I don't even know if I should say this, but I think this could happen again, given the opportunity.
The city of New York has always been a place where millions of lives collide. Every night, beneath the glow of towering skyscrapers and the endless movement of crowded streets, thousands of stories unfold quietly. Some are stories of ambition, survival, and dreams finally coming true. Others are stories of tragedy, where a single moment changes everything. On a cold February night in 1999, in a quiet neighborhood in the Bronx, one of those moments arrived. It lasted only a few seconds. But the consequences would echo for decades. A young man stood outside the entrance of his apartment building on Wheeler Avenue. He was not running from anyone. He was not looking for trouble. He was not carrying a weapon. He was simply standing there, at the end of an ordinary day, in a city where he had come searching for a better future. His name was Amadou Diallo. He was 23 years old. He was thousands of miles away from the country where he was born, trying to build a new life in America. To many people passing by that night, he was just another face among millions in New York City. Another immigrant trying to survive. Another young man chasing the promise that had brought so many before him across oceans and borders. But within moments, he would become one of the most recognized names in America's ongoing debate about police power, fear, and the thin line between protection and tragedy. Because before that night ended, 41 bullets would be fired. And when the gunfire stopped, Amadou Diallo would be lying on the ground. The object in his hand would not be a weapon. It would be a wallet. Inside would be the simple belongings of an ordinary man. Money. Identification. Personal documents. Proof that the person standing in front of the building was not a threat. He was someone who had been misunderstood in the darkest possible way. The story of Amadou Diallo is not only about the shots that were fired. It is about everything that happened before them. The dreams that brought him to America. The fears carried by police officers walking through a dangerous city. The split-second decisions made in the space between life and death. And the question that would remain long after the headlines disappeared. When someone responsible for protecting lives makes a mistake, who pays the price? For Amadou Diallo, the answer came on a freezing night in the Bronx. Before he became a symbol, Amadou Diallo was simply a son. He was born in 1975 in Guinea, a country on the western coast of Africa. His childhood was not defined by violence or crime. He grew up in a family that valued education, responsibility, and hard work. His father was involved in business, and like many families who hoped to provide their children with more opportunities, they encouraged ambition. Amadou was raised with the belief that the world was larger than the streets around him. There were opportunities beyond the borders of Guinea. There were possibilities waiting somewhere else. For many young people from Africa during that period, America represented more than a country. It represented a dream. A place where determination could create a future. A place where someone willing to work hard could build something from nothing. In the early 1990s, Amadou made the decision that would change the direction of his life. He traveled to the United States. Like countless immigrants before him, he arrived carrying hopes that were much larger than the luggage he brought with him. New York City was overwhelming. The streets were louder. The buildings were taller. The pace was faster. The language was unfamiliar. The culture was different. But Amadou adapted. He did what millions of immigrants have done throughout American history. He worked. He learned. He adjusted. He tried to belong. He found employment selling items on the streets and in small businesses. He lived with relatives and focused on creating stability. He studied English because he understood that communication was the key to opening doors. Every day was a small step forward. Every paycheck was proof that his decision had been worth it. Every phone call home was a reminder of the family and country he had left behind. Those who knew Amadou described him as a quiet and respectful person. He was not someone who searched for conflict. He was not known as a person who attracted attention. He preferred a simple life. Work. Family. A future. The kind of future that many people around the world imagine when they hear the phrase, the American dream. But sometimes tragedy does not arrive because someone chooses the wrong path. Sometimes tragedy arrives when two completely different worlds collide. On one side of that street in the Bronx were 4 police officers. They belonged to the NYPD Street Crime Unit, a specialized group created to fight serious crime in some of New York's most dangerous neighborhoods. Their job was built around suspicion. They were trained to look for threats. They searched for armed criminals. They responded to robberies. They entered situations where hesitation could be deadly. Every night they walked into uncertainty. Every stranger could potentially be dangerous. Every movement could have meaning. By February 1999, New York City had changed dramatically from the crime crisis of previous decades, but many neighborhoods still carried the weight of violence. Robberies and shootings remained a reality. Police officers working these streets often lived with constant awareness that the next encounter could become a fight for survival. On the night of February 4th, the members of the Street Crime Unit were patrolling the Bronx. They were searching for suspicious activity connected to robbery reports in the area. They were not looking for Amadou Diallo specifically. They did not know his name. They did not know his story. They did not know that the man they were about to approach had spent years trying to create a peaceful life in America. They only saw a figure standing near the entrance of a building late at night. And in that moment, perception became reality. The officers believed they were seeing something dangerous. Amadou Diallo believed he was simply encountering people in the street. Neither side understood what the other was experiencing. And within moments, those misunderstandings would become irreversible. The distance between them was only a few steps. But those steps would lead to one of the most controversial police shootings in modern American history. A moment that would transform a quiet immigrant from Guinea into a symbol remembered across an entire nation. A moment that would force New York to confront uncomfortable questions about fear, judgment, and the power carried by those who wear a badge. Because before the world knew the name Amadou Diallo, there was only a young man standing outside his home, waiting for tomorrow. Unaware that tomorrow would never come, the Bronx has always been a place of contradictions. To some people, it is a symbol of struggle. A borough that carried the scars of poverty, crime, and decades of social challenges. To others, it is a place of resilience, creativity, and survival. A neighborhood where generations of families built lives despite the difficulties surrounding them. By the late 1990s, the Bronx was no longer the same place it had been during the darkest years of the 1970s and 1980s. The abandoned buildings, burning apartments, and streets dominated by open violence had begun to disappear. New investments were coming in. Crime rates had fallen dramatically. Communities were rebuilding. But beneath that progress, fear still existed. Many residents remembered the years when stepping outside at night could carry real danger. They remembered the sound of sirens cutting through the streets, the presence of gangs, and the stories of people who never made it home. For police officers assigned to these neighborhoods, that history shaped the way they viewed the world. The streets were not just streets. They were places where danger could appear without warning. A person standing alone at night could be innocent. Or that person could be hiding something. A movement of a hand could mean nothing. Or it could mean a weapon. In the minds of officers trained to survive dangerous encounters, hesitation could cost a life. This was the environment that surrounded the final moments of Amadou Diallo. A city full of millions of people. A neighborhood filled with ordinary lives. And a police department trying to balance public safety with the responsibility of using force carefully. In the years leading up to the shooting, the New York Police Department was going through a transformation. Under the leadership of Commissioner Howard Safir and Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, NYPD had adopted aggressive policing strategies designed to reduce crime. The department emphasized proactive enforcement. Officers were encouraged to stop suspicious individuals, question people in high-crime areas, and take action before crimes occurred. Supporters argued that this approach helped make New York safer. They pointed to falling crime numbers and a city that was becoming more secure. But critics raised concerns. They questioned whether aggressive policing placed too much power in the hands of officers. They argued that certain communities, especially communities of color, experienced more frequent police encounters. The debate was already present before February 1999. But after the death of Amadou Diallo, that debate would explode into a national conversation. Because the question was no longer theoretical. It had a name. It had a face. It had a family waiting for answers. The 4 officers involved that night were members of the NYPD Street Crime Unit. This unit was created with a specific purpose. Its officers were not ordinary patrol officers responding to routine calls. They were assigned to confront serious criminal activity. They investigated robberies. They searched for armed suspects. They worked in areas where violence was more common. Their training focused heavily on awareness and survival. Every encounter carried a potential threat. Every decision had consequences. The officers involved in the Diallo shooting were experienced. They were not new recruits walking into their first dangerous situation. They believed they understood how quickly circumstances could change. And on that night, they believed they were facing exactly the kind of danger they had been trained to confront. But the tragedy was that the person they encountered was not the person they believed him to be. Amadou Diallo lived on Wheeler Avenue in the Soundview section of the Bronx. The area was a typical working-class neighborhood. People came and went from apartment buildings. Neighbors knew each other. Families lived ordinary lives behind closed doors. Children grew up there. Workers returned home after long shifts. People dreamed about better futures. On the surface, nothing about that night suggested that history was about to be made. There was no major crime scene. No hostage situation. No chase through the streets. No armed confrontation. Only a man standing outside a building. That was what made the case so shocking. The tragedy did not begin with a violent criminal act. It began with a misunderstanding. Shortly after midnight on February 4, 1999, the city was quiet in the way New York can sometimes be quiet. Not completely silent. New York is almost never silent. There are always distant sounds. Cars moving through streets. People talking. The hum of the city continuing through the night. But compared with the daytime chaos, the late hours create a different atmosphere. The streets become emptier. The shadows become longer. People walking alone become more noticeable. For someone watching from a distance, a person standing outside a building after midnight might appear unusual. For someone who lives there, it might be completely normal. Amadou Diallo was not waiting for trouble. He was simply outside his home. Perhaps he was getting some fresh air. Perhaps he was returning from somewhere. Perhaps he was simply standing there, taking a quiet moment before going inside. No one knows exactly what thoughts were passing through his mind during those final minutes. Maybe he was thinking about his family. Maybe he was thinking about work the next day. Maybe he was thinking about the future he was still trying to build. A future that had required courage and sacrifice. A future that had brought him across an ocean. At the same time, 4 officers moved through the neighborhood. They were conducting what they believed was a routine investigation. They were looking for signs of criminal activity. According to their later statements, they noticed Amadou Diallo and believed he resembled a suspect connected to recent crimes. That detail would become one of the most debated aspects of the case. Because resemblance is not identity. A person can look like someone else. A person can stand in the wrong place at the wrong time. A person can become part of a situation they never created. But in police work, officers often have to make decisions with incomplete information. They do not always know the entire story. They see fragments. A movement. A shadow. A reaction. A hand reaching somewhere. And they must decide what those fragments mean. The tragedy of Amadou Diallo was born from that exact moment. From the space between what was seen and what was actually happening. The officers approached. They were wearing plain clothes rather than traditional police uniforms. That detail would later become a major point of discussion. A uniform immediately identifies authority. A badge represents the state. A person knows who is approaching them. But plain clothes create uncertainty. For Amadou Diallo, seeing several unfamiliar men approaching in the middle of the night would have been confusing. For the officers, approaching a person they suspected might be connected to crime created tension. Two groups of people. Two different perspectives. Two different understandings of the same moment. And neither side could know how quickly everything would change. The officers later said they identified themselves as police. They said they gave commands. They said they told Diallo to show his hands. But investigators would later examine every detail of what happened in those final seconds. How clearly were commands given? Could Diallo understand what was happening? Did he know the approaching men were police officers? Was there enough time for him to respond? These questions would become central during the investigation and trial. Because after the gunfire ended, everyone agreed on one fact. Amadou Diallo was dead. The argument was about why. In the hours after the shooting, the Bronx woke up to a scene that seemed impossible. A young man was gone. A family was searching for answers. A police department was defending the actions of its officers. And a city was preparing for a confrontation that would continue for months. The story of Amadou Diallo was no longer just a local incident. It became a national symbol. A symbol of fear. A symbol of mistrust. A symbol of the complicated relationship between police and the communities they serve. But before the protests, before the courtroom battles, before the debates on television screens across America, there was only the beginning. A quiet street. A young immigrant. For officers approaching. And a few seconds that would change everything, before his name became known across America, before newspapers placed his photograph on front pages, before politicians and activists debated what his death represented, Amadou Diallo was simply a young man trying to build a life. He was not born into the story that history would later create for him. He did not choose to become a symbol. He did not wake up one morning imagining that his name would become connected to one of the most controversial police shootings in modern American history. He was just Amadou. A son. A friend. A worker. An immigrant chasing a dream. And to understand the tragedy of February 4, 1999, it is important to understand the person who stood at the center of it. Because behind every headline, behind every argument, behind every political debate, there was a human being whose life had meaning long before the world learned his name. Amadou Diallo was born in 1975 in Guinea, a country located along the Atlantic coast of West Africa. Guinea was a nation rich in culture and history, but like many developing countries during that period, it also faced economic challenges that limited opportunities for many young people. For ambitious young men and women, the world beyond Guinea's borders represented possibility. The idea of traveling abroad was not simply about leaving home. It was about searching for opportunity. It was about building something that could support not only themselves but also their families. Amadou grew up in a household where responsibility mattered. His family valued hard work and education. His father was involved in business, and from an early age, Amadou learned the importance of discipline and determination. He was not someone who dreamed of fame or wealth. His ambitions were much simpler. He wanted stability. He wanted independence. He wanted to create a future where he could provide for himself and help those who had supported him. Those who knew him remembered a young man who carried himself with quiet confidence. He was not the type of person who demanded attention. He listened more than he spoke. He observed before he acted. He believed that patience and persistence could open doors. Like many immigrants, Amadou's journey to America was not easy. Leaving home meant leaving behind everything familiar. The streets where he grew up. The people who knew him since childhood. The language and culture that surrounded him. The comfort of being somewhere he belonged. Immigration is often described through simple words like opportunity or a better life. But behind those words are difficult sacrifices. An immigrant does not only travel across geography. They travel across uncertainty. They enter a place where they must prove themselves again. They must learn new systems. They must adapt to new expectations. They must sometimes accept jobs far below their potential because survival comes before dreams. Amadou understood that reality. When he arrived in the United States in the early 1990s, he entered a city unlike anything he had known before. New York was enormous. Millions of people moved through its streets every day. Every language could be heard. Every culture existed somewhere within the city's neighborhoods. For many newcomers, New York could feel overwhelming. But it was also a place where reinvention was possible. A person could arrive with nothing and slowly create a new identity. That possibility was what attracted Amadou. Life in New York was not glamorous. There was no instant success. There was no easy path. Amadou worked hard to survive. He found employment selling goods. He lived with relatives. He focused on improving his English. Every day brought another challenge. But he continued moving forward. He was building his life one small step at a time. Those who knew immigrants understand that progress often happens quietly. A person learns a few more words in a new language. They save a little more money. They send support back home. They create relationships. They slowly become part of a new community. That was Amadou's reality. He was not chasing a fantasy. He was working toward a practical future. From Guinea, his family watched his journey with pride. For many families, when one member leaves home to seek opportunities abroad, that person carries the hopes of everyone who remains behind. Amadou was not just living for himself. He represented possibility. Every success he achieved was a source of happiness for his relatives. Every phone call home was a connection between two worlds. America and Guinea. The present and the past. The life he was building and the family he still loved. His family could not have known that one night in February would transform their private grief into a public battle for answers. They could not have imagined that their son, brother, and loved one would become a name spoken by millions. In New York, Amadou lived a quiet existence. There were no stories of violence surrounding him. No criminal record. No history suggesting he was dangerous. He was not someone police knew. He was not someone authorities were searching for. He was simply a young man standing at the entrance of his building. This detail would become one of the most painful parts of the case. Because when people discussed Amadou Diallo after his death, many asked the same question. Who was he before that moment? The answer was not found in police reports. It was found in the memories of people who knew him. A person who worked. A person who dreamed. A person who wanted a better future. Those closest to Amadou described him as gentle and respectful. He was the kind of person who avoided unnecessary conflict. He was focused on improving himself. He understood that as an immigrant, his choices mattered. One mistake could damage everything he had worked for. So he kept his life simple. He went to work. He returned home. He stayed connected to his family. He continued believing that effort would eventually create opportunity. There was nothing about his life that suggested he would become the center of a national controversy. But history often chooses ordinary people for extraordinary moments. The tragedy of Amadou Diallo is also the tragedy of a future that disappeared. At 23 years old, his life was still beginning. There were years ahead that he would never experience. There were conversations he would never have. Places he would never visit. People he would never meet. The possibility of marriage. The possibility of building a family. The possibility of returning to Guinea one day and showing everyone how far he had come. All of those possibilities ended outside a Bronx apartment building. Not because of a long criminal investigation. Not because of a planned attack. But because of a brief encounter between a young immigrant and 4 police officers who believed they were facing danger. After his death, people around the world saw Amadou Diallo differently. To some, he became a symbol of the dangers of excessive police force. To others, he became an example of the difficult decisions faced by officers working in dangerous environments. But before he became either of those things, he was a person. And perhaps the most important part of his story is remembering that. Because when a person becomes a symbol, sometimes the individual disappears. The photographs become more famous than the memories. The arguments become louder than the human story. The debates become bigger than the life that was lost. But Amadou Diallo was not born to represent a movement. He was not born to become a headline. He was born to live. On the night of February 4, 1999, Amadou stood outside his home. He was only a few steps away from the place where he lived. A place that should have represented safety. A place where he should have been able to return after another ordinary day. He could not know that within minutes, strangers would approach him. He could not know that those strangers were police officers. He could not know that a misunderstanding was about to unfold. And he could never know that his name would survive long after him. Because Amadou Diallo's story did not end when the bullets stopped. In many ways, that was when the world began asking questions about who he was, what happened to him, and how a quiet night in the Bronx became one of the defining moments in America's debate over policing and justice. The world would remember the 41 bullets. But before the bullets, there was a life. A life that mattered. A life filled with dreams. A life that deserved to continue. The night of February 4, 1999, began like many other nights in the Bronx. There was nothing to suggest that history was about to unfold on a quiet street in Soundview. The city continued moving. Cars passed through the neighborhood. Apartment windows glowed with the ordinary lives of people inside. Some residents were sleeping. Some were returning home after work. Some were simply waiting for another day to begin. And outside one apartment building on Wheeler Avenue stood a young man named Amadou Diallo. He was 23 years old. He was standing near the entrance of his home. A place that should have been familiar. A place where he should have felt safe. But within minutes, that doorway would become the center of one of the most controversial police shootings in American history. Shortly after midnight, the members of the NYPD Street Crime Unit were moving through the neighborhood. The officers were not dressed in traditional police uniforms. They were working undercover, wearing plain clothes. Their mission was to identify and stop criminal activity in an area where robberies and violent crimes had been reported. The officers were experienced. They were trained to observe details that ordinary people might overlook. A person's movement. A person's behavior. A person's reaction when approached. In police work, especially in high-crime areas, these details can sometimes mean the difference between life and death. But they can also create a dangerous possibility. A mistake. A misunderstanding. A person can appear threatening without being dangerous. A person can look suspicious without having done anything wrong. And on this night, that possibility would become reality. As the officers drove through the neighborhood, they noticed Amadou Diallo standing outside the entrance of his apartment building. According to the officers' later statements, something about the situation caught their attention. A man standing outside. Late at night. Near a building. They believed he resembled a person connected to previous robbery reports. That belief would become one of the central issues of the entire case. Because from that moment forward, the officers were no longer seeing only Amadou Diallo. They were seeing what they thought he might represent. A possible suspect. A possible threat. A possible danger. But Amadou Diallo was not aware of that. He did not know what information the officers believed they had. He did not know why they were approaching him. He did not know that a simple movement of his hand would soon be interpreted through the lens of fear. The officers approached. 4 men. In plain clothes. Moving toward him in the darkness. For Amadou, the situation was unclear. Unlike a uniformed officer, someone wearing ordinary clothing does not immediately communicate authority. A badge may not be visible. A person may not immediately understand who is standing in front of them. The officers later said they identified themselves as police. They said they gave commands. They said they ordered Diallo to show his hands. But what happened in those final moments remains the subject of debate. What did Amadou hear? What did he understand? What did he believe was happening? Those questions would never be fully answered. Because Amadou Diallo would never have the chance to tell his side of the story. According to the officer's account, Diallo did not respond in the way they expected. Instead, he moved backward toward the entrance of the building. Then came the moment that changed everything. His hand moved toward his clothing. To the officers, this movement looked dangerous. They believed he might be reaching for a weapon. In a matter of seconds, a possibility became a belief. A belief became a reaction. And that reaction became irreversible. One officer later stated that he saw a dark object in Diallo's hand. The officers believed they were facing an armed man. They believed they were about to be shot. Their training told them what to do when they believed a deadly threat was present. They drew their weapons. And they fired. The first shots shattered the quiet of the Bronx night. The sound echoed between buildings. Residents nearby suddenly woke up. A moment earlier, everything had been normal. Then came the sound that every city resident fears. Gunfire. The officers continued shooting. The entire encounter lasted only a matter of seconds. But inside those seconds, dozens of decisions were made. The officers fired repeatedly. The night was filled with the sound of gunshots. When it ended, 41 bullets had been fired. Amadou Diallo collapsed near the entrance of the building. The young man who had left Guinea searching for opportunity. The man who worked, studied, and supported his family. The man who had no criminal record. Was lying on the ground. After the shooting stopped, the reality of what had happened began to emerge. The officers approached. The object they believed was a weapon was examined. It was not a gun. It was not a knife. It was not anything that could harm them. It was a wallet. A simple black wallet. Inside were ordinary personal items. Money. Identification. Documents. The evidence of an ordinary life. The very object that had triggered the shooting was the same object that revealed the tragedy. Amadou Diallo had not been reaching for a weapon. He had been reaching for something that belonged to him. The realization changed the atmosphere immediately. A few moments earlier, the officers believed they had survived a deadly encounter. Now they were standing over the body of an unarmed man. A man they had mistaken for a threat. A man whose life had ended in front of his own home. For the officers, the situation became a nightmare of another kind. They had to answer a question that would follow them for years. Why? Why did this happen? Why did a routine encounter become a fatal shooting? Why were 41 bullets fired at a man who had no weapon? For the neighborhood, the shock was immediate. Residents struggled to understand what they had witnessed. A young man who lived among them was suddenly gone. The entrance of the building where neighbors walked every day had become a crime scene. The place where people returned home became the place where a life ended. And soon, the entire country would know what happened there. The number 41 would become permanently connected to the case. 41 bullets. A number repeated in newspapers, television reports, protests, and courtroom arguments. For many people, that number represented excessive force. It represented a failure of judgment. It represented a tragedy that should never have happened. For others, the number represented the chaos of a dangerous encounter. They argued that officers do not always have the luxury of perfect information. They argued that officers must make instant decisions when they believe their lives are threatened. The debate would continue for months and years. But before the legal arguments began, before politicians made statements, before protesters filled the streets, there was only one undeniable fact. Amadou Diallo was dead. His family received news that no family should ever receive. A son who had left home searching for a better future was gone. The dreams he carried with him had ended thousands of miles away from where they began. For his parents and relatives in Guinea, the distance made the pain even harder. They were not there. They could not hold his hand. They could not see the place where he died. They could only listen as the world explained how their son's life had ended. The shooting of Amadou Diallo was not a planned killing. There was no evidence that the officers intended to murder him. That complexity would become central to the case. This was not a story about a criminal hunting a victim. It was a story about perception, fear, training, human reaction, and the devastating consequences that can happen when those elements collide. The tragedy was not created by one single moment. It was created by a chain of decisions and circumstances. A neighborhood shaped by fear. A police unit trained to search for danger. A late-night encounter. A misunderstanding. A movement of a hand. A belief that a weapon was present. And 41 bullets. In the days that followed, investigators would begin reconstructing every second of the encounter. They would examine the scene. They would question the officers. They would analyze the evidence. They would attempt to answer what happened in those few moments outside the apartment building. But for many people, the most important question was already clear. Who was Amadou Diallo? And how did a young man standing outside his home become the center of a national crisis? The investigation was beginning. The courtroom battle was coming. But the first chapter of the tragedy had already been written. A young immigrant's dream had ended on a Bronx sidewalk. And America was about to begin a painful conversation about justice, accountability, and the power carried by those who are sworn to protect the scene behind the headlines. In the hours after the gunfire stopped on Wheeler Avenue, the Bronx slowly began to understand that something extraordinary had happened. At first, it was only a sound. A sudden burst of violence cutting through the quiet of the night. A series of gunshots that caused residents to open their windows, look outside, and wonder what had happened. In New York City, especially in neighborhoods that had lived through years of crime and violence, the sound of gunfire was not completely unfamiliar. But this was different. This was not a robbery. This was not a street fight. This was not an armed suspect running through the neighborhood. This was a young man lying motionless outside his own home. And standing nearby were 4 members of the New York Police Department. The people who were supposed to represent safety were now at the center of the most disturbing question facing the community. How could a man with no weapon end up dead after an encounter with police? The scene outside the apartment building quickly became a place of investigation. The area was secured. Evidence markers were placed. Detectives began documenting what remained after the shooting. Every detail mattered. Every bullet casing. Every position. Every piece of physical evidence. The goal of any investigation after a police shooting is to reconstruct a moment that lasted only seconds. Investigators must take chaos and turn it into a timeline. They must determine what happened first. What happened next? And what could have been different? But reconstructing those final seconds would prove incredibly difficult. Because the most important person in the investigation could no longer speak. Amadou Diallo was gone. One of the first and most important discoveries at the scene was the object found near Diallo. The officers had believed they were responding to a deadly threat. They believed the object in his hand could be a firearm. But when investigators examined it, the truth was completely different. It was a wallet. A black wallet containing personal items. There was no gun. No weapon. No object capable of causing harm. The discovery immediately transformed the nature of the investigation. What had the officers believed they saw? What had actually happened? And how could a wallet become mistaken for a deadly weapon? Those questions would define the case. For investigators, the challenge was not simply determining what was found. They had to understand why 4 trained officers reacted the way they did. The officers said they believed their lives were in danger. They said the situation unfolded quickly. They said they had to make decisions in a matter of seconds. This became the central argument that would later be presented in court. A police officer does not experience a dangerous encounter the same way an observer does afterward. A person watching a video or looking at evidence after the event has time. Time to think. Time to analyze. Time to consider alternatives. But officers in the middle of a confrontation do not have that luxury. They must make decisions while experiencing fear, uncertainty, and adrenaline. The question in the Diallo case was whether that fear was justified. Or whether it caused a tragic mistake. The investigation focused heavily on the actions of the officers. All 4 had fired their weapons. The number of shots immediately attracted attention. 41 bullets. It was a number that shocked the public. For many people, the question seemed simple. How could so many shots be fired at someone who was not armed? But investigators had to examine more than emotion. They had to examine procedure. Training. Reaction time. Officer perception. Ballistics. The physical evidence. The psychological reality of a high-stress encounter. One of the issues examined was the environment itself. The shooting happened at night. The lighting conditions were poor. The officers were wearing plain clothes. The encounter happened quickly. All of these factors became important. Darkness changes perception. Stress changes perception. Fear changes perception. A person may see movement differently when they believe they are facing danger. A hand moving toward clothing can appear completely different depending on what someone believes is happening. To the officers, it was a possible weapon. To Amadou Diallo, it may have been nothing more than reaching for his wallet. Two realities existed at the same moment. Only one of them was true. The investigation also examined whether racial perception played a role. This became one of the most controversial parts of the case. Amadou Diallo was a young black immigrant. The officers were members of a police unit operating in a neighborhood where crime prevention was a major focus. Critics argued that racial assumptions and aggressive policing practices contributed to the tragedy. They questioned whether Diallo was treated as suspicious because of who he was rather than what he had done. Supporters of the officers rejected that argument. They said the officers were responding to circumstances, not race. They argued that the officers believed they were confronting a dangerous situation and acted according to their training. The debate would continue throughout the investigation and trial. As investigators worked to understand what happened, Amadou Diallo's family struggled with a different reality. For them, this was not a legal question. It was personal. They were not thinking about police procedures or courtroom strategies. They were thinking about a son who would never come home. A brother who would never call again. A family member whose future had disappeared. The public conversation focused on the shooting. The family focused on the person they lost. They remembered Amadou before the tragedy. Before the headlines. Before the arguments. Before his name became associated with a national debate. They remembered the young man who left Guinea with dreams. The young man who worked hard. The young man who wanted a normal life. As news spread, the story quickly moved beyond the Bronx. The details were impossible to ignore. A young immigrant. 4 police officers. 41 shots. No weapon. The case became a national discussion. Television networks covered the investigation. Newspapers analyzed every detail. Communities across America began discussing questions that had existed for years but were now impossible to avoid. How should police respond to uncertainty? How much force is reasonable? How can officers protect themselves while protecting innocent people? Who should be held responsible when a mistake ends a life? Inside the NYPD, the shooting also created pressure. Police officials defended the officers while acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. The department had to answer difficult questions about training and tactics. Were officers prepared to handle encounters like this? Were procedures effective? Could this type of tragedy happen again? Every police department depends on public trust. Without trust, even legitimate law enforcement actions become questioned. The Diallo case damaged that trust among many New Yorkers, especially among communities that already felt distant from the police. The evidence collected at the scene would become the foundation of the legal battle that followed. The wallet. The bullets. The officers' statements. The physical layout of the location. The timeline of events. Every detail would be examined. Every decision would be challenged. Because the case was no longer only about what happened. It was about responsibility. It was about whether a tragic mistake could also be considered a crime. In the weeks after the shooting, investigators continued working to answer one question. Was this a justified police response to a perceived threat? Or was this an unnecessary use of deadly force against an innocent man? The answer would determine the future of 4 police officers. It would determine the reaction of an entire city. And it would shape the legacy of Amadou Diallo forever. Because outside that Bronx apartment building, investigators had discovered more than physical evidence. They had discovered a conflict that would define a generation. A conflict between fear and accountability. Between police authority and civilian rights. Between what officers believed they saw and what actually happened. The investigation had only begun. And the search for justice was about to become one of the most closely watched legal battles in America. After the discovery at the scene, the investigation into the death of Amadou Diallo moved from the quiet streets of the Bronx into police offices, prosecutors' chambers, and eventually the center of a national debate. The physical evidence was clear. A young man had been shot. 41 rounds had been fired. The object found in his hand was not a weapon. But the question that remained was far more complicated. Why did 4 trained police officers believe they were facing a deadly threat? And was that belief enough to justify what happened? The investigation would not only examine the actions of the officers. It would examine the culture of policing in New York City. It would examine the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. And it would force the public to confront a difficult reality. Sometimes the most important moments in a tragedy happen before anyone pulls a trigger. They happen in the mind. In perception. In assumptions. In the way one person sees another. The first stage of the investigation focused on reconstructing the timeline. Detectives needed to understand exactly how the encounter unfolded. They examined the location where Diallo had been standing. They studied the positions of the officers. They analyzed the bullet impacts. They reviewed the statements given by the 4 officers. Every second mattered. A police shooting is not investigated like an ordinary crime scene. The investigators are not only searching for a person responsible. They are trying to determine whether the use of force followed the rules officers are trained to follow. The central question was not simply, did the officers shoot Amadou Diallo? Everyone knew they did. The question was, were they justified in doing so? The 4 officers involved were members of the street crime unit. Their backgrounds immediately became part of the discussion. They were not inexperienced officers. They were not people who had just joined the department. They were trained members of a specialized unit whose purpose was to confront serious criminal activity. This fact created 2 opposing interpretations. Supporters of the officers argued that their experience made their actions understandable. They said these officers were trained to recognize danger and had encountered situations where hesitation could have deadly consequences. They believed the officers reacted based on the information available to them at that moment. But critics saw the same facts differently. They argued that experienced officers should have been better prepared to control the situation. They questioned whether the officers escalated the encounter too quickly. They asked why a person who was not attacking them ended up being shot 19 times. The statements from the officers became a crucial part of the investigation. According to their accounts, they believed Diallo was behaving suspiciously. They believed he matched the description of a possible robbery suspect. They said that when they approached him, he moved backward toward the building entrance. They said they identified themselves as police officers. They said Diallo reached toward his clothing. And in that instant, they believed he was reaching for a gun. For the officers, the moment was not about a wallet. They did not know it was a wallet. They believed they were facing a firearm. That belief shaped every decision that followed. But investigators and prosecutors had to consider another perspective. What if Amadou Diallo did not know who was approaching him? What if he was confused? What if he was afraid? What if he was simply reacting to strangers approaching him in the middle of the night? These questions became central because the encounter involved 2 different realities. The officers saw a possible threat. Diallo may have seen unknown men approaching him. The same movement could be interpreted in completely different ways. A hand reaching into clothing. To one person, it could mean danger. To another, it could mean nothing more than retrieving personal belongings. The issue of plain clothes became one of the most debated aspects of the investigation. The officers were not wearing standard police uniforms. This meant Diallo may not have immediately recognized them as law enforcement. In a dark environment, with several men approaching quickly, confusion was possible. Critics argued that plainclothes officers carrying firearms created a dangerous situation. They questioned whether Diallo had enough information to understand what was happening. Supporters of the officers responded that undercover and specialized units often operate in plain clothes because their assignments require it. They argued that criminals also use confusion and surprise, making these situations extremely difficult for officers. Again, the investigation reached the same difficult question. How should people be expected to react when everyone believes they are in danger? The role of training became another major focus. Police training teaches officers to respond quickly when they believe a weapon is present. In many situations, hesitation can be deadly. But critics argued that training must also teach restraint. A police officer carries the authority of the government. The ability to use deadly force is one of the greatest powers given to any individual. Because of that power, many argued that officers must be held to the highest standards. The debate surrounding Amadou Diallo was not only about four officers. It was about what society expects from those who carry guns and badges. As the investigation continued, public attention intensified. The case became impossible to separate from larger discussions happening across America. Issues of race, policing, and justice had already created tension in many communities. For many people, the death of Amadou Diallo represented a pattern they believed had existed for years. They saw a young black man killed by police despite having no weapon. They saw a system that, in their view, protected officers more than civilians. For others, the case represented the difficult reality of police work. They believed officers were forced to make impossible decisions in dangerous circumstances. They feared that punishing officers for mistakes made under pressure could make police officers hesitate when confronting real threats. The investigation also brought attention to the street crime unit itself. The unit had been praised for fighting crime aggressively. But critics questioned whether its methods encouraged officers to view too many civilians as potential threats. The Diallo case became part of a broader examination of aggressive policing tactics. Were officers creating safer communities? Or were they creating more fear between police and residents? These questions had no easy answers. Meanwhile, Amadou Diallo's family continued searching for justice. They did not see their son as a statistic. They did not see him as part of a political argument. They saw him as Amadou, the young man who had left Guinea with hope. The son who wanted to succeed. The person whose life had been reduced to a few seconds of violence. His mother and father wanted the world to remember that he was not defined by the circumstances of his death. He was defined by the life he lived. As prosecutors reviewed the evidence, they faced an enormous responsibility. Charging police officers in a deadly force case is always complicated. The legal system recognizes that officers are sometimes required to use force. But it also recognizes that power must have limits. The prosecutors had to decide whether the evidence supported criminal charges. Not whether the shooting was tragic. Not whether people were angry. But whether the officers' actions crossed the legal line. Eventually, the case moved forward. The four officers were charged with serious crimes, including second-degree murder and reckless endangerment. The decision sent shockwaves through New York. It meant the officers would have to defend their actions in court. For supporters of Amadou Diallo, it represented a step toward accountability. For supporters of the officers, it represented concern that police were being punished for making split-second decisions. The city prepared for a courtroom battle that would attract national attention. But before the trial began, another difficult question emerged. Could these officers receive a fair trial in the Bronx? The case had become so emotionally charged that officials worried about whether a local jury could remain impartial. The shooting had divided communities. The name Amadou Diallo had become associated with a national movement. The names of the officers had become associated with a controversial use of force case. The atmosphere was no longer simply legal. It was deeply emotional. The decision was eventually made to move the trial away from the Bronx. The case would be transferred to Albany, New York. The change of location reflected just how significant the case had become. It was no longer only about what happened on Wheeler Avenue. It was about the meaning of that moment. It was about trust. It was about justice. It was about whether a system could fairly judge those responsible for enforcing the law. As the trial approached, both sides prepared their arguments. The prosecution would argue that Amadou Diallo was an unarmed man who posed no threat. The defense would argue that 4 officers believed they were seconds away from being killed. Between those two arguments stood the same unanswered question. What truly happened in those final moments before the first shot was fired? The investigation had uncovered the evidence. But the courtroom would decide how that evidence should be understood. And soon, America would watch as the story of Amadou Diallo moved from the streets of the Bronx to the center of a courtroom where the meaning of justice itself would be tested. As the investigation into the death of Amadou Diallo continued, the case entered a critical stage. The initial shock had passed. The images of the crime scene had spread across newspapers and television screens. The public had already formed opinions. Some people believed they understood exactly what happened. Others believed the truth was more complicated. But inside the offices of prosecutors, investigators, and legal teams, emotion had to be separated from evidence. The question was no longer only about what people felt. It was about what could be proven. Because in a courtroom, tragedy alone is not enough. A criminal conviction requires evidence. It requires showing that someone's actions crossed a legal boundary. And that would become the greatest challenge in the Amadou Diallo case. The investigation had produced several critical pieces of evidence. The first was the most obvious. The weapon that was never found. From the beginning, one fact shaped everything. Amadou Diallo was not carrying a gun. The officers had believed he was armed. But the object they feared was a weapon was a wallet. This fact became the foundation of the prosecution's argument. They argued that the officers' perception was wrong. They argued that a mistaken belief could not automatically justify deadly force. But the defense saw the situation differently. They argued that the officers should be judged based on what they reasonably believed at the moment they fired, not based on what was discovered afterward. That distinction would become the heart of the trial. In police use of force cases, one of the most difficult questions is the difference between reality and perception. Reality is what actually exists. Perception is what someone believes exists. In Amadou Diallo's case, the reality was clear. There was no gun. There was no attack. There was no weapon. But the defense argued that, in those few seconds, the officers did not know that. They believed they saw a gun. They believed they were in danger. They believed they had to act immediately. The legal system would have to determine whether that belief was reasonable. The number of bullets fired became one of the most controversial parts of the case. 41 shots. The number appeared everywhere. It became a symbol. For many people, 41 bullets represented excessive force. They struggled to understand how a situation involving an unarmed man could end with so many rounds being fired. They asked whether the officers had lost control of the situation. Whether training had failed. Whether the response had gone beyond what was necessary. But the defense offered another explanation. They argued that the officers were not standing still and calmly firing one shot at a time. They described a chaotic moment. A rapid exchange of movement. Fear. Adrenaline. A situation where officers reacted together after believing one of their own was facing a deadly threat. The investigation also examined the actions of each officer individually. All 4 officers fired their weapons. But each person experienced the moment from a different position. Each person made decisions based on what they saw, what they heard, what they believed. This created a complicated legal situation. The prosecution had to show that the officers' actions were criminal, not simply mistaken. The defense had to convince the jury that the shooting was a tragic but justified response to a perceived threat. Another major issue was whether Amadou Diallo had enough opportunity to understand what was happening. The officers said they identified themselves as police. But questions remained. How visible were they? How clear were their commands? How much time did Diallo have to react? A person standing alone outside at night may not respond the same way when approached by strangers as they would when approached by uniformed officers. This uncertainty became one of the most important parts of the case. Because a misunderstanding can become dangerous when both sides are acting based on incomplete information. As prosecutors prepared the case, they also considered the broader impact. They knew this was not an ordinary trial. The public was watching. Communities across New York were watching. Police officers across the country were watching. The outcome would influence how people viewed police accountability. A conviction could be seen as a message that officers must be held responsible for mistakes involving deadly force. An acquittal could be seen by many as proof that the system protected police officers even when civilians died. The pressure was enormous. The defense team focused heavily on the mindset of the officers. They wanted the jury to understand what it felt like to be in that moment. They described officers working in a dangerous environment. They described the fear that comes with believing someone may be reaching for a gun. They argued that police officers do not have the luxury of waiting to see whether a weapon appears. Because if they wait too long, the consequences can be fatal. Their argument was simple. The officers were not trying to kill Amadou Diallo. They were trying to survive. The prosecution focused on another idea. Responsibility. They argued that a badge does not remove accountability. They argued that police officers receive special authority because society trusts them with power. And because they have that power, they must exercise greater control. The prosecution questioned whether the officers moved too quickly. Whether they relied too heavily on fear. Whether a different response could have prevented the tragedy. Their argument was that Amadou Diallo paid the ultimate price for a mistake. The case also became connected to a larger national discussion about race. Many people believed that if Amadou Diallo had been a different person, in a different community, the outcome might have been different. They pointed to the history of police encounters involving black men. They argued that suspicion was not distributed equally. They believed the case represented a deeper problem within American policing. Others rejected the idea that race was central. They argued that the officers responded to circumstances, not identity. They believed turning the case into a racial issue ignored the dangers police officers face. The disagreement reflected a divide that existed throughout the country. As the trial approached, the legal teams prepared their final strategies. The prosecution had evidence. The defense had explanations. But neither side could change one undeniable fact. A young man was dead. No argument could bring him back. No verdict could erase what happened outside that Bronx building. The trial could determine legal responsibility. But it could not reverse time. One of the most significant developments before trial was the decision to move the case away from the Bronx. Officials believed that the intensity of public reaction could make it difficult to find an impartial jury. Albany, New York, was chosen as the new location. The move reflected how much the case had grown. A local police shooting had become a national event. The courtroom would not simply examine evidence. It would become the stage where two competing stories would meet. One story about an unarmed immigrant who lost his life. Another story about officers who believed they were moments away from death. The trial would force everyone involved to return to those final seconds. The approach. The commands. The movement. The gunfire. The wallet. Every detail would be examined. The jury would have to imagine themselves standing where those officers stood. But they would also have to remember the person who was no longer there to explain what happened. Amadou Diallo. The young man whose future ended before anyone knew his name. As the city waited for the courtroom battle to begin, one question remained above all others. Could justice exist in a case where the truth depended on understanding a moment that lasted only seconds? For the officers, the trial represented their freedom, their careers, and their reputations. For Amadou Diallo's family, it represented something much more personal. It represented the possibility that the world would acknowledge what they had lost. A son. A brother. A human being. The next chapter would take the tragedy from the streets of the Bronx into a courtroom where 12 jurors would decide the fate of 4 police officers. And the entire country would be watching. The courtroom in Albany, New York, became the new battlefield in the case of Amadou Diallo. Months earlier, the story had unfolded on a dark street in the Bronx. A young man standing outside his home. For police officers approaching. A sudden burst of gunfire. 41 bullets. Now, the same events would be reconstructed through testimony, evidence, and legal arguments. The streets had been replaced by a courtroom. The sounds of gunfire had been replaced by the voices of attorneys. But the central question remained unchanged. Were the 4 officers justified in taking Amadou Diallo's life? Or had an innocent man been killed because fear overwhelmed judgment? The decision to move the trial away from the Bronx had been controversial. The case had become so emotionally charged that officials believed it would be difficult to select an impartial jury in the community where the shooting happened. For many residents of the Bronx, the decision felt like another painful moment. They believed the tragedy happened in their neighborhood. They believed their community should have been the place where justice was determined. But prosecutors argued that moving the trial was necessary to protect the integrity of the process. The goal was not to satisfy public anger. The goal was to create a courtroom where evidence, not emotion, would decide the outcome. When the trial began, the courtroom carried the weight of national attention. Journalists followed every development. Civil rights organizations watched closely. Police supporters paid attention to every argument. The case had become larger than the people directly involved. For many Americans, it represented a much broader question. How should society judge police officers who used deadly force? The prosecution presented its case first. Their argument focused on a simple but powerful fact. Amadou Diallo was unarmed. They reminded the jury that after the shooting, investigators found no gun. No knife. No weapon. Only a wallet. They described a young man who was standing near his home when he was approached by officers who believed he was dangerous. The prosecutors argued that the officers acted too quickly. They argued that the situation could have been handled differently. They questioned whether deadly force was truly necessary. Their message to the jury was clear. A mistake by police can still have consequences. A badge does not make someone above the law. The prosecution also focused heavily on the number of shots fired. 41. They argued that the number itself showed a loss of control. They questioned whether the officers continued firing after the threat had already passed. They asked the jury to imagine the scene. A man trapped against a building entrance. Multiple officers firing weapons. A person who turned out to have no way to harm them. The prosecution wanted the jury to see the shooting not as a simple misunderstanding, but as a failure of restraint. Then came the defense. The attorneys representing the officers presented a very different picture. They asked the jury to return to the perspective of the officers at that moment. Not what they knew afterward. Not what investigators discovered later. But what they believed during those few seconds. The defense argued that police officers do not have perfect information. They argued that officers cannot wait until a weapon is fired before responding. They described the encounter as a terrifying situation where 4 officers believed they were facing a man with a gun. Their argument centered on one principle. A reasonable mistake is not the same as a crime. The defense brought attention to the environment officers were working in. They described the dangers faced by members of the street crime unit. These officers were assigned to areas where violent crime occurred. They were trained to recognize threats. They were trained to react quickly. The defense argued that if officers genuinely believed someone was reaching for a weapon, they had a duty to protect themselves. They told the jury that the tragedy was real. The loss was real. But tragedy alone did not prove criminal wrongdoing. One of the most important parts of the trial involved the officers describing their fear. They explained what they believed they saw. They described the moment when Diallo's hand moved. They described believing that a gun was appearing. They described the instinctive reaction that followed. Their testimony gave the jury a look into the psychological pressure of a deadly force encounter. The defense wanted the jury to understand that these were not people calmly analyzing a situation afterward. They were officers making decisions in a moment of extreme stress. But prosecutors challenged that explanation. They argued that fear cannot become a justification for every action. They questioned whether the officers had created a dangerous situation by approaching Diallo the way they did. They questioned whether plainclothes officers gave clear enough identification. They questioned whether Diallo had a fair chance to understand what was happening. Their argument was that the officers' own decisions contributed to the tragedy. Throughout the trial, the question of perception remained central. What did the officers think they saw? What did Amadou Diallo think was happening? The officers saw a possible threat. The evidence showed there was no threat. The jury had to decide whether the officers' belief was reasonable. This was the difficult legal issue at the center of the case. The law does not judge police officers based only on the outcome. It examines their actions based on what they reasonably believed at the time. Outside the courtroom, emotions continued to rise. Supporters of Amadou Diallo gathered to demand accountability. They believed his death represented a larger problem. They believed too many people had been harmed by excessive police force without consequences. They saw the trial as a test of whether the justice system valued every life equally. Supporters of the officers gathered as well. They argued that police officers should not be treated as criminals for making decisions under dangerous conditions. They feared that prosecuting officers for mistakes could make police hesitate in situations where hesitation could cost lives. The trial became a symbol of two competing fears. One fear was that police officers could use deadly force against innocent people and avoid accountability. The other fear was that officers could be punished for making split-second decisions while trying to survive. Both sides believed they were defending justice. Both sides believed the other side did not understand the reality they faced. And in the middle of that conflict was the memory of Amadou Diallo. After weeks of testimony, the case moved toward its conclusion. The attorneys delivered their final arguments. The prosecution reminded jurors that a young man had lost his life without ever threatening anyone. The defense reminded jurors that 4 officers believed they were seconds away from being killed. The jury was given the responsibility of deciding which interpretation matched the evidence. On February 25, 2000, the verdict arrived. The courtroom waited. Families waited. The city waited. The decision would determine whether 4 police officers would face criminal punishment. The jury found all 4 officers not guilty. They were acquitted of all charges. The officers would not go to prison. The reaction was immediate. For the officers and their supporters, the verdict confirmed what they had argued from the beginning. The shooting was a tragic mistake made during a perceived life-threatening encounter. They believed the justice system had recognized the reality of police work. But for Amadou Diallo's family and many others, the verdict was devastating. They believed justice had failed. They believed an unarmed man had died and no one would be held criminally responsible. The decision deepened the divide that had already formed around the case. Outside the courthouse, emotions were intense. People who had followed the case for months expressed anger, disappointment, and frustration. The verdict did not end the debate. In many ways, it expanded it. Because the legal question had been answered. But the moral question remained. Was this justice? Could a system be fair when a person died without a weapon and no officer was convicted? The Amadou Diallo case had now reached its legal conclusion. But its impact was only beginning. The courtroom battle was over. The national conversation was not. The name Amadou Diallo had become permanently connected to questions about policing, race, and accountability. His death forced America to examine uncomfortable realities. How much power should police have? How should mistakes be judged? How can communities trust those who carry authority over them? The verdict freed 4 officers from criminal punishment. But it could not erase what happened. It could not return Amadou Diallo to his family. It could not restore the future that disappeared on Wheeler Avenue. And it could not silence the questions that continued to follow. Because sometimes a trial ends. But a debate continues. And for New York City, the story of Amadou Diallo was far from finished. The verdict had been delivered. The courtroom battle was over. For police officers had been found not guilty. Legally, the case had reached its conclusion. But for many people, especially those who had followed the story from the beginning, the feeling was that something remained unresolved. Because a verdict can answer a legal question. It cannot always answer a human one. The law had determined whether the officers should be punished criminally. But the city of New York was left with deeper questions. Questions about trust. Questions about responsibility. Questions about how a moment lasting only seconds could change so many lives forever. For the family of Amadou Diallo, the verdict brought a pain that no courtroom decision could remove. They had traveled through months of uncertainty. They had listened to descriptions of their son's final moments. They had watched strangers debate his life on television. They had heard his name become part of arguments about politics, policing, and race. But behind all of those discussions, they remembered something much simpler. They remembered Amadou. The young man who left Guinea with hope. The son who wanted to build a future. The person who believed hard work could create a better life. To them, he was never just a case. He was never just a symbol. He was family. The tragedy of losing someone is often measured not only by the moment of death but by all the moments that will never happen. For Amadou's family, the pain was connected to everything he would never experience. The birthdays that would never come. The conversations they would never have. The dreams that would never become reality. He was 23 years old. An age when many people are still discovering who they are. An age when the future still feels unlimited. There were possibilities waiting for him. But those possibilities ended outside a Bronx apartment building. In the months following the verdict, New York City experienced a wave of protests. Thousands of people gathered to express anger, frustration, and demands for change. The demonstrations were not only about one shooting. For many participants, the case represented years of concerns about police treatment of minority communities. They believed the death of Amadou Diallo reflected a larger pattern. They questioned whether the justice system held police officers accountable in the same way ordinary citizens were held accountable. The protests became a public expression of a question that had existed for years. Who watches those who have the power to use force? One of the most visible figures during the protests was civil rights activist Al Sharpton. He organized demonstrations and became one of the strongest public voices calling for accountability. His message was that the death of Amadou Diallo should not disappear after the headlines faded. He argued that the case represented a broader struggle for equal treatment under the law. Many protesters agreed. They believed that without pressure from the public, meaningful reform would not happen. Some demonstrations involved acts of civil disobedience. Protesters intentionally allowed themselves to be arrested as a way to draw attention to their demands. They believed peaceful disruption was necessary to force leaders to respond. These actions created additional debate. Supporters viewed them as a legitimate form of protest. Critics argued that they unfairly targeted police officers and disrupted public order. Once again, the case revealed a deep division in how different groups understood justice. Inside the New York Police Department, the shooting also created serious reflection. The department faced difficult questions. Could the encounter have been handled differently? Did officers receive enough training? Were existing procedures effective? How could police protect themselves while reducing the chance of innocent people being harmed? These questions were not simple. Police work involves uncertainty. Officers often encounter situations where they must make decisions without knowing everything. But the authority to use deadly force carries enormous responsibility. The Diallo case forced law enforcement leaders to examine that balance more closely. The shooting also influenced discussions about police training. Departments across the country continued examining how officers are taught to handle high-pressure situations. Training programs focused on several areas. Recognizing threats accurately. Communicating clearly. Using alternatives when possible. Controlling emotional reactions. The goal was not simply to make officers react faster. It was to help them make better decisions under pressure. Because the greatest challenge in many dangerous encounters is not only speed. It is judgment. The case also became an important part of discussions about implicit bias. The concept refers to unconscious assumptions that can influence how people interpret situations. Supporters of this idea argued that everyone carries experiences and expectations that shape perception. In a high-stress situation, those hidden assumptions can affect decisions. Critics argued that focusing too much on bias could unfairly accuse officers who genuinely believe they are responding to danger. The debate surrounding Amadou Diallo became part of a much larger national conversation about how perception influences policing. Years after the shooting, the name Amadou Diallo continued to appear in discussions about police reform. His case was often mentioned alongside other controversial police encounters. Each case was different. Each circumstance had its own facts. But together, they represented a continuing national struggle. How can society create a system where police officers can perform their dangerous jobs while civilians remain protected from unnecessary harm? The impact of the case extended beyond policy discussions. It also changed how many people viewed police interactions. For some communities, especially communities that already felt distant from law enforcement, the Diallo case reinforced feelings of fear and mistrust. Some residents wondered, if someone like Amadou Diallo, who had no weapon and no criminal history, could die during a police encounter, could it happen to anyone? That fear affected relationships between citizens and police. Trust, once damaged, is difficult to rebuild. For police officers, however, the case created a different kind of concern. Many officers felt that the public did not understand the dangers they faced. They believed the criticism ignored the reality of making decisions in dangerous environments. They worried that fear of public reaction or legal consequences could cause hesitation during encounters where immediate action might be necessary. This became another difficult question. How do you demand accountability without making those responsible for public safety afraid to act? The story of Amadou Diallo also remained personal for the officers involved. They had been cleared in court. But the consequences of the shooting continued. Their names were permanently connected to one of the most controversial moments in NYPD history. They had to live with the knowledge that their actions ended a person's life. Even when a court finds someone not guilty, the emotional weight of a fatal encounter does not simply disappear. The case also changed the way America discussed police shootings. Before Amadou Diallo, many incidents involving police force received limited national attention. But the Diallo case occurred at a moment when media coverage was expanding. News networks followed the story closely. Communities organized. Activists mobilized. Technology and communication allowed information to spread faster. The case became an early example of how a local police encounter could become a national conversation. More than 2 decades later, the image of Amadou Diallo remains powerful. Not because of how he died, but because of who he was before that moment. A young immigrant. A worker. A son. A person who believed in the possibility of a better future. The tragedy is that the world learned his name only after his life had ended. The most important part of remembering Amadou Diallo is understanding that his story did not begin with the shooting. It began in Guinea. It continued through his journey to America. It lived in the work he did and the relationships he built. It existed in the dreams he carried. The gunfire lasted only seconds. But his life was much larger than those seconds. The questions raised by the case remain part of American society today. The balance between police authority and civilian rights continues to be debated. The challenge of reducing unnecessary force while protecting officers continues. The search for trust between communities and law enforcement continues. And at the center of that conversation remains the memory of a young man whose life ended far too soon. Amadou Diallo did not become a symbol because he wanted to. He became one because of what happened to him. But behind the symbol was a person. Someone who had a childhood. Someone who had dreams. Someone who had people who loved him. And perhaps the greatest lesson from his story is that before any person becomes a headline, they are always a human being first. A life. A story. A future that mattered. The Bronx street where Amadou Diallo fell became more than a crime scene. It became a place where America confronted uncomfortable questions about justice and power. The 41 bullets became a number remembered across generations. But behind that number was one name. Amadou Diallo. And behind that name was a life that deserved to continue, the questions that never disappeared. More than 2 decades have passed since the night Amadou Diallo stood outside his apartment building in the Bronx. The city has changed. The streets have changed. The technology used by police has changed. The conversations surrounding law enforcement have evolved. But the questions created by that night have never completely disappeared. Because some events are not remembered only because of what happened. They are remembered because of what they forced society to confront. The death of Amadou Diallo became one of those moments. A moment when an entire city stopped and asked, what happens when those given the power to protect people make a devastating mistake? Where is the line between a necessary police response and excessive force? And how can justice exist when one person's fear leads to another person's death? When people discuss Amadou Diallo today, they often begin with the number 41. 41 bullets fired in a matter of seconds. 41 shots that transformed an ordinary night into a national controversy. But numbers, while powerful, can also hide the person behind them. Before there was a number, there was Amadou. A young man from Guinea. A person who crossed an ocean believing that hard work could create a better future. A person who had family members waiting for his success. A person who was still becoming the man he hoped to be. The tragedy of his death is not only that he was killed. It is that the world never discovered what he might have become. The case of Amadou Diallo was not a simple story of good versus evil. That complexity is exactly why it remained so controversial. There was no evidence that the officers planned to kill him. There was no evidence that they woke up that night intending to harm an innocent person. The officers believed they were responding to danger. They believed they saw a threat. They believed they were protecting their own lives. But the result was undeniable. An unarmed man was dead. And a family lost someone they loved. Both realities existed at the same time. That was what made the case so difficult. The tragedy forced people to examine the psychology of high-pressure decisions. Human beings do not always process information perfectly when they are afraid. Fear can narrow attention. Stress can speed up reactions. The brain can focus on the possibility of danger while ignoring other explanations. In a dangerous environment, this reaction may protect someone. But in the wrong situation, it can create disaster. The Diallo case became an example often discussed in law enforcement training because it showed how quickly perception can become reality in a person's mind. The officers did not see a wallet. They saw what they believed could be a gun. And that difference changed everything. For police departments, the case became a reminder that training must involve more than teaching officers how to respond to danger. It must also teach them how to recognize uncertainty. How to communicate. How to slow situations down when possible. How to avoid turning fear into automatic action. Modern policing increasingly focuses on the idea that effective law enforcement is not only about control. It is also about judgment. Because the authority to use force comes with a responsibility to use that force carefully. The Diallo case also became a defining moment in discussions about accountability. Many people argued that police officers must be held to the same standards as everyone else. They believed that if an ordinary citizen had fired 41 shots at an unarmed person, the legal consequences would be severe. They questioned why police officers should receive different treatment. Supporters of law enforcement responded that police officers operate under unique conditions. They argued that society gives officers the ability to use force because there are moments when force is necessary. They warned that judging every tragic outcome as a crime could make officers afraid to act when real danger exists. This disagreement remains one of the most difficult debates in modern society. People on both sides often believe they are protecting something important. One side emphasizes civilian safety and accountability. The other emphasizes officer safety and the realities of dangerous situations. The challenge is finding a system where both principles can exist. A society needs police officers who can act when necessary. But it also needs citizens who know that those powers are not unlimited. The death of Amadou Diallo also changed the conversation about race and policing. For many people, the case became another example of how Black Americans and immigrant communities experienced encounters with law enforcement differently. They argued that history, stereotypes, and unequal treatment influenced how some people were perceived as threats. They believed that cases like Diallo's could not be separated from broader social issues. Others argued that the specific facts of each case mattered most. They believed the officers should be judged based on the circumstances they faced, not larger political debates. Again, the case became part of a national conversation that continued long after the courtroom closed. Years later, other police-related cases would bring similar discussions back into the national spotlight. The names changed. The locations changed. The circumstances changed. But the questions remained familiar. How should police use force? How should officers be trained? How should communities and law enforcement rebuild trust? The legacy of Amadou Diallo became connected to these continuing conversations. Not because every case was identical, but because his death represented a moment when America began looking more closely at these issues. For the people who loved Amadou, however, the most important thing has always been remembering him as a person. Not as a political symbol. Not as a courtroom argument. Not as a headline. They remember the young man who left Guinea hoping for a better future. They remember his personality. His kindness. His determination. His quiet ambition. They remember that before the world debated his death, he lived a life. A short life. But a meaningful one. The building entrance on Wheeler Avenue became a place associated with tragedy. But it was also the place where Amadou lived his everyday life. It was a place where he returned after work. A place where he carried groceries. A place where he spoke with neighbors. A place that represented home. That detail is perhaps what makes the story so painful. He was not somewhere dangerous. He was not in the middle of a crime. He was standing near the place where he lived. A place where he should have been safe. The legacy of Amadou Diallo is ultimately about more than a police shooting. It is about human vulnerability. It is about how quickly life can change. It is about the responsibility that comes with power. It is about the consequences of decisions made in seconds but remembered for decades. Every profession has moments where judgment matters. But few professions carry consequences as serious as policing. A decision made in a moment of fear can permanently change the lives of everyone involved. For the 4 officers involved, that night became the defining event of their lives. For Amadou's family, it became the moment that separated their lives into 2 parts. Before February 4, 1999. And after. Before that night, Amadou was a son building a future. After that night, he became a name known across America. A name connected to grief. A name connected to controversy. A name connected to a national conversation about justice. But perhaps the most important way to remember Amadou Diallo is not through the sound of gunfire. Not through courtroom arguments. Not through political debates. But through the life he was trying to create. A young man who believed in possibility. A person who crossed thousands of miles searching for opportunity. Someone who wanted the same things many people want. A safe home. A stable future. A chance to succeed. The story of Amadou Diallo remains painful because there is no ending that feels complete. The officers were acquitted. The family lost their son. The city moved forward. The debate continued. No verdict could satisfy everyone. No explanation could undo what happened. Some tragedies do not leave behind simple answers. They leave behind questions. And sometimes, those questions become the reason a society continues searching for improvement. On that cold February night in the Bronx, a young immigrant stood outside his home. He was not carrying a weapon. He was not committing a crime. He was simply there. A moment later, his life was gone. But his name remained. Amadou Diallo. A name that continues to remind America of the fragile space between protection and harm. Between fear and understanding. Between power and responsibility. And a reminder that behind every statistic, every argument, and every headline, there is always a human life. A life that mattered.